No. Just a welcome to Julia Woodman's School, and also a welcome to Britta Forstrom's school, who are with us today. And also, I think quite a few of Jamie McDowell's regulars are with us. So that's nice. So welcome to you all. It's nice to have you all together for John. And I see John's here now. People are still pouring in, and I think there will be more. But what I'll do is give you a quick introduction to John now. And basically, I pinched this off his website, so you can read much more information for yourself at any time. Quickly, that John Nicholls has been teaching for 45 years and has trained many teachers in several countries around the world. He's traveled around and for several years run training courses here and there. And I was lucky enough and unlucky enough to have 1 year of that at the Carrington training course before he headed off to Melbourne. And he ran a training course there for several years, and then he ran a training course in Brighton for several years, and then he ran a training course I think in New York for several years. And I think nowadays he does a lot of postgraduate work for teachers, travels around training courses. And I certainly hope he's going to visit us once we're up and running properly. Bit rude to say that publicly when he hasn't said he will yet, but it's a plug for it. A quick description of what he's going to speak to us about today is about feeling and sensory appreciation. And here's his description. You can go through all of Alexander's writings and find many quotes about how unreliable our feeling sense is, our sensory appreciation, why we shouldn't trust it, and how improved use may feel wrong. Yet you can also go through these writings and find equally as many quotes telling us that the purpose of having lessons is to improve your sensory appreciation, to make it more reliable, so it can be a helpful guide to you. This will be a talk/stroke discussion around this seeming dichotomy about feeling and how to resolve it, while touching also on why the negative version of feeling can have detrimental effects on people's experience and development with the Alexander technique. So I think a few more people will drift in, but it's coming up to 5 past. So if I may, I'll hand over to John in a moment. A reminder again that I will keep everybody muted just so that there's not background noise and echoes, but it's not to silence you. You can unmute yourself manually, or if you just press the space bar, if you've got a laptop or a desktop, that will unmute you while you're speaking, while you hold it down. So John, are you ready? So you'll need to unmute yourself.
I've just done, I'm ready.
Great, so over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes. There we go.
Okay, I'm going to bring back up the gallery view, I think.
Or would you prefer that? Yes, I can do that, sorry.
Yes, can you do that?
Yep.
Or I can do it from my, I've done it from my end, Peter.
Right, has that restored it for everybody? Yeah, okay. Yes, it's a bit
I just find it easier to look at rows of faces. It gives a little more the sense that, you know, I'm actually talking to a group of real people. So.
Absolutely.
Okay. Gosh, I see a number of people I know there and some old friends. Thank you all for coming. Oh, we've got 3, not just 2 screens now. Wow. Okay, enough of trying to recognize people. I agreed quite a while back now with Peter to do this, and at that time we settled on a theme, a topic. So that all seemed fine. And at the beginning of this week, I started thinking, wow, I need to take this seriously now. You know, I've got to actually prepare something. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to regret actually choosing this theme. And I'll tell you why. Because on Monday morning, it occurred to me that actually there's very little to say on this subject, because you can encapsulate the entire subject, the essence of the entire subject, in 2 sentences. So I'm actually going to give you those 2 sentences right now. So this is the headline, you might say. And, you know, when you hear these 2 sentences, if you feel, okay, yep, done, you know, click the leave button and make more productive use of your time. So here's the headline. Initially, when you begin having Alexander lessons, your kinesthetic sense may not be accurate. You need to hold it in abeyance and allow the hands-on lessons to take effect. Later, you'll find the experiences gained in those lessons have sharpened, have sharpened your kinesthesia so that it becomes a more useful source of information, particularly when it's telling you that you're going wrong. And that's it. That summarizes the whole topic. However, if you do decide to stay, I will now see if I can flesh that out with more substantial information. Gosh, at this time of the day, light comes into my office from over there, and here are my notes. And when I put them there, there's not enough light to read them. So I'm going to have things kind of here in front of me. Anyway, my own thinking on this subject was re-stimulated a few months ago by a teacher asking me questions about a particular section in FM's last book, The Universal Constant in Living. And it's in, I've got it here, in part 2 of chapter 5 of this book, the Moritz edition. This is page 79. And this is one of the places where FM describes in quite some detail, or I might even say prescribes in quite some detail, how to go about starting giving a first lesson. So he says, I'll read you some bits from this section. To this end, from the beginning of the first lesson, the teacher does his best to reassure the pupil and allay any anxiety on his part as to whether or not he'll be able to carry out instructions rightly. He explains to him he does not want him to try to be right in carrying out instructions, because that would only mean projecting messages which would result in his reacting to the instructions by the habitual use of himself, which feels right, but that he can prevent this if on receipt of any stimulus to activity, such as to sit down, he will make the decision to refuse to give consent to carry out the activity. ... The way is thus cleared for the teacher to help him to employ new means whereby it is pointed out to him that under the changed conditions, the new use of himself may and probably will feel wrong to him at first, but that through the experience he will gain in his lessons, the new use will in time come to feel right, etc., etc. Now, when, as I say, a few months back, a teacher asked me about this, it reminded me of the conversation, one of many, many useful, helpful conversations I had with Walter Carrington over the years that I was there every day as an assistant at Lansdowne Road. Talking with Walter about the way FM describes giving lessons in his books, Walter said to me, if you try to teach literally exactly as FM describes lessons in his books, you will get yourself into a lot of trouble. That's a big statement. If you try to teach literally exactly as FM describes lessons in the books, you will get yourself into a lot of trouble. And, you know, those of us who knew Walter Carrington will know Walter was not exactly a revolutionary character. You know, he was not the kind of person who would say, oh, it's all rubbish, you know, we're going to do this whole new way. So thinking about that leads me on to, let me think about this a moment. Well, let's just put yourself in the situation. This is always a valuable imaginative exercise. You put yourself in the situation of a person who's never had Alexander lessons. You go back to where you were 10 minutes before your first ever Alexander lesson. Now, it's quite likely that someone coming for a first lesson may be a bit nervous. In fact, they're coming for something that is, even today, a bit unusual, a bit out of the range of what they might have encountered before, a bit, we could almost say, a bit odd. So you go in there with this little bit of uncertainty about this rather odd thing, and there's this person starts speaking to you, and to be told straight off that you're to respond to the teacher's instructions by refusing to respond, and to be told straight off that, and of course it's going to feel wrong, it doesn't seem all that well calculated to reduce the anxious sense that something very odd is going on. And I believe there's an important distinction to be made here between an important distinction to separate the principles FM is aiming to convey in this paragraph in Universal Constant, the principles he's aiming to convey from the literal description or prescription that he writes for the first lesson. Now, the points that FM is making are clear and they're important, but that doesn't mean that they have to be conveyed in precisely the manner and the order he describes here. I have known teachers who do proceed from the outset using the in and out of the chair movement as an exemplar, and immediately launching into telling the pupil to say no to the request to sit down or stand up, and perhaps allow the teacher to guide them. All this along with pointing out that it's all probably going to feel wrong. And I've heard some pupils say that their first lesson experiences went along those lines and it worked fine for them. However, I've heard others say their first experience followed that formula and they were very dissatisfied by the strange and really rather dogmatic artificiality of it. So this little imaginative exercise of putting yourself back to 10 minutes before your first ever lesson is something I always advise newly qualifying teachers to try out when you think about how you are going to give a first lesson. Look back at that first experience that you had, and it doesn't matter if it was a good experience or a not so good experience. Because of course, if it was a really good experience, you've got something terrific there to build on. You can teach on that basis. You're teaching from that good experience. But equally, if it was not a good experience, you've learned something from that. We might say, well, you know what not to do when you're giving a first lesson. But in terms of the principles that FM is communicating there, you could say that what counts is that in your own time, over a period of not necessarily one, but maybe several lessons, you find a way that suits your personality and interests and the personality of interests of your student to gradually introduce the practice of inhibition, let's say a conscious pause before reacting, and to introduce or to deal with any concerns about new use possibly feeling, I think I'd say strange rather than wrong. And I say several lessons, so how many is several? Well, the answer can only be as many as it takes. Teaching any craft or skill involves the teacher being sensitive to how much the pupil can take in and bringing in new elements only at a pace that the pupil or student can absorb. So in Walter's terms, that statement he said to me, taking this FM description literally would mean assuming you have to introduce all these elements at the very start of the very first lesson, and that might well get you into trouble, as Walter said. By the way, as we go along, I thought about, when preparing something like this, how to deal with questions. Generally, when I've done these things, I think it works better if you could, if anything I'm saying sparks a question in you, could you just sort of hold it, put it on the back burner, make a note of it so you don't lose it. And at a couple of points during this morning, we will then clear the decks and give time for questions. But I think it works better that way rather than interrupting the flow and possibly getting sidetracked. So make a quick note of anything you want to ask a question about. Now, on the issue of feeling wrong, personally, I find in my own experience, and that's about 45 years of teaching, I think FM rather exaggerates the degree to which people feel wrong. What I've generally found is that when I, as a teacher, help someone to get some improvement in their use, they'll most commonly say it feels good. My own experience when I first had lessons, and I must say when I first had lessons, I was in such a mess and I was so kinesthetically numb, such a contracted mess that I didn't feel anything for, I think it was 17 lessons. God knows why I persevered, but anyway, but when I did actually have a first experience of what I would call going up, I thought, I like this. It's very, very enjoyable. And I sometimes think that the tradition of emphasizing you can't trust your feelings, your sensory appreciation is unreliable, that tradition has led to a sort of reticence about saying, you know, one of the great things about the Alexander technique is that it feels so good. I mean, why are we all doing it? Why have we gotten so involved in it? You know, it is really quite a wonderful experience. So obviously there are occasions when someone says it feels wrong, and FM mentions something in that section in Universal Constant about this. Generally, when someone really feels wrong, it's a change in the angular alignment of the body, shall we say. So a very, very typical one is the person whose lower body has been constantly pulled forward, whose upper body is therefore sort of going back somewhat in order to, well, you know, one compensates for the other, or they're mutually compensatory, however you like to look at it. And I'm sure, you know, experienced teachers have all had this situation where you get the head and upper body coming forward and up instead of being pulled back and down. And the person says, but I feel I'm leaning forward. You get the situation, obviously, the scoliotic situation where the person untwists a bit and says they feel twisted. In fact, having myself had a mild degree of scoliosis, I can tell you that during my 3 years of training, there was a period when every time I lay on the table or lay on the floor at home, it seemed to me suddenly blindingly kinesthetically clear and obvious that my entire thorax was rotated leftwards relative to my head and pelvis. About a year later, every time I lay on the table or lay on the floor, it was blindingly kinesthetically obvious that my entire thorax was rotated to the right relative to my head or pelvis. And that's just what happens when things untwist, they unravel. There's a bit of a corkscrewing effect. And of course, there's also the, you're looking at it through the lens of the past experience. One other thing that's worth noting that I've never really heard spoken about situations that people say feel wrong, is when you do your sort of classic in and out of the chair thing with people, and you guide their head and neck, and you find a way to help them inhibit the typical pulling back and down of the head. I found interestingly that when someone no longer does that, when they move in and out of a chair or in and out of any kind of semi-flexed or squatting attitude, they feel as if their entire trunk, their entire torso is leaning way, way further forward, and it feels weird and a little bit unnatural. And you can use mirrors, or actually modern technology is great because you can use one of these. You can take a photo or even a 5-10-second video to show people actually what's happening, because often the trunk is not going any further forward than it was before. But when the head isn't going way back, when the head is going with the trunk, the internal perception is that it's all going way, way further forward. So a minor thing, but I haven't heard anybody speak about that before. That's another classic "it feels wrong" situation. There's a nice example of what people more commonly experience from Frank Pierce Jones. And when I first came across Frank Pierce Jones' writing, and was actually lucky enough to meet him on sometime in the 1970s, I've forgotten which year, mid-70s, he came to visit London, and he spent several days coming into the Carrington's training and had some interesting conversations with us. Frank, in his book, describes his own first lesson with A.R. Alexander. And far from feeling wrong, Frank says it felt, quote, strangely comfortable. And he says he really enjoyed the sensory effect of lightness. Later in the same chapter, he writes about his experience as a teacher, giving lessons, giving first lessons to new people. And he says, quote, the feeling of pleasure in an everyday movement takes most subjects by surprise, and their faces break spontaneously into a smile as they notice it. I really like that. So I hope you as teachers have, in giving first lessons to people, a lot more of the surprise smile effect and a lot less of the "but it feels wrong" moments. Now, there are plenty of places in FM's writing where he emphasizes the unreliability of sensory appreciation and the dangers of relying on it. You can find some of them in the collection of FM quotes on the subject in that very valuable section on the Moritz website. Regina Strattel and Shan Fisher. By the way, Regina's book on Irene Tasker is terrific, I think. It's a very, very good piece of work. On the Moritz website, there's a section, I think, called Key Concepts. Look under there for sensory appreciation. You'll find plenty about how unreliable it is and how dangerous it is to pay attention to it and so on. However, some years ago, I took it on myself to go through all of Alexander's writing and pick out the sections where he emphasizes that the process of having lessons is one which re-educates and refines the sensory appreciation to the point where it becomes more reliable and actually useful. In fact, he indicates that it's an essential part of learning to put the technique into practice. So here's a few examples. And by the way, I put all of this on my website, johnnicholsat.com. There is a menu item called videos, podcasts, and articles. Click on that. There's a drop down or a long page. I have to scroll down a little bit past the videos, past the podcasts. You'll find a PDF called FM Quotes on Developing a Reliable Sensory Appreciation. There's about 4 pages of them in there, but I'm just going to read you a few little samples from CCCI. We must be prepared in cases where the instinctive processes are unreliable to restore the sensory appreciation to that standard of reliability upon which the adequacy of the functioning of all psychophysical processes depends. Then again, the first thing we need is to gradually acquire a reliable sensory appreciation during a process of re-education, readjustment, and coordination on the basis of constructive conscious guidance and control. And again, our first effort should be devoted to the establishment in the individual of a reliable sensory appreciation. Now, here's one that is especially relevant to those of you teaching and those of you who are training to be Alexander teachers. Here he writes, "This brings us face to face with the demand for a teaching technique which will meet this difficulty. Such a technique involves correct manipulation on the part of the teacher in the matter of giving the pupil correct experiences in sensory appreciation, in the sphere of re-education, readjustment, and coordination. Furthermore, in order to give these satisfactory sensory experiences, the teacher must himself be in possession of a reliable sensory mechanism and have gained the experience in re-education and coordination that is required for a satisfactory readjustment of the organism." So some of FM's vocabulary, you smile sometimes, readjustment of the organism. Sort of something rather reminiscent. I think I know he also uses imagery of a car mechanic readjusting the mechanisms of the car. So here he is readjusting the mechanism of your organism. But so highlighting there that if you're going to teach this, and if part of your role as a teacher is to bring about experiences and give instruction that will help your student improve their sensory appreciation, make it more reliable, you need to have done a lot of that work on yourself to have gotten to the point where your sensory appreciation is a lot more useful and reliable. After all, you've got to be a sensory register. I'm almost tempted to say a sensory arbiter or arbitrator for 2 people, yourself and the student you're teaching. One last thing on this, he writes about the confidence that an improved sensory register gives you. He says, "This confidence is further reinforced by the pupil's confidence in the reliability of his sensory appreciation, which ensures that any interference with the coordinated use of himself will come to his consciousness as soon as it occurs." Now, that's an important thing that we'll come back to, that sensory, that more reliable, that educated sensory appreciation will enable, in a situation, where is it now? any interference with good use of yourself will come to your consciousness as soon as it occurs. Awareness of going wrong is a crucial aspect in all of this. So I need to put that aside. And as I say, you'll find those on my website. Now, when going through FM's writing on this subject, I also took in that whole collection of what have usually been called teaching aphorisms. In the book, again, a Moritz publication, FM Alexander Articles and Lectures, you'll also find a collection devoted to these. And I believe these were gathered together by Ethel Webb, who I think is it accurate? Who apart from A.R. Alexander and the assistants that FM had back in Melbourne and Sydney, Ethel Webb was FM's first assistant in the UK, in London. And apparently she would sit outside his teaching room and she could easily hear what was going on. And whenever he said anything to the private student, to the pupil, that she thought was interesting, she would jot it down. So eventually this was typed up, and I remember it used to be passed around Alexander teachers in London in my early days in the form of a typescript, really, just a collection of A4 pages. And then it was put together into an early version of the Alexander Journal, I think. But there's one quote in there that seems to blow everything I've said out of the water. And that's a quote where FM says to somebody, when the time comes that you can trust your feeling, you won't want to use it. What am I going to say to that? As I say, it blows it out of the water, puts a spanner in the works, or whatever you want to say. However, if you're looking at the Moritz volume, if you go a few lines further down the very same page, here's another quote. As a matter of fact, feeling is much more use than what they call mind when it's right. So put those two side by side, they seem to totally contradict each other. No wonder Alexander teachers often feel a bit insecure and puzzled. Our master, our founder, did leave some rather contradictory elements. So how do we deal with that? Well, I've always thought that these teaching aphorisms need to be seen in context. There's Ethel Webb sitting in the corridor outside FM's teaching room, and apparently there was no door to the teaching, it was an open doorway. So she's sitting out there at the desk and she's hearing what he's saying, and he's saying things to different pupils. I bet any experienced teacher says different things to different pupils. If you went into the Carrington's training back in the 1980s, you would find when Walter Carrington would come in at 12 o'clock to give his 30-minute talk, you would find an array of audio cassette recorders on the floor in front of him. More and more people would bring in their little Sony Walkman type or whatever recorders. And whenever anyone said, Walter, do you mind if I record you? He used to say, you can record me as much as you like, my dear, as long as you don't expect me to be consistent. And I think what he was getting at there is, again, in different contexts, you will say things that appear to be inconsistent. And certainly you can just imagine FM in the room with one particular student who's having difficulties, who's asking awkward questions, and FM comes out off the top of his head with these impromptu, spontaneous responses. So I really don't think. Oh, and I should also add that everything, of course, I never knew FM. There's nobody here on this presentation, on this Zoom meeting, who actually knew FM. But I knew a lot of people who did know him and told stories about him. I've read a lot of things. I've always had the impression that, after all, he was a rather dramatic kind of character, that he was rather given to making dramatic and rather provocative statements. A good example of that is if you read the excellent book that Luli Westphal wrote back in the early 1950s about her time with FM. She found this rather irritating, I think, and gives some very good examples of his dramatic, slightly hyperbolic statements. So I really don't think that we should give as much weight to these teaching aphorisms as we do to what's written in the books, where, again, everyone who knew him said that he put a lot of thought and care and attention into crafting those extraordinary, lengthy sentences in the books. Let me move on from there. Yeah. So at this point, we're talking about the lessons improving someone's sensory register, and that having an improved sensory register is a vital part of learning to put the Alexander technique into practice. So an obvious question that can be asked at this point is the question, well, when will I know if my sensory appreciation has become reliable enough for me to make some use of it or pay attention to it? Tricky question. Very tricky question. So I had a little fantasy the other day about this. You know, we live in a highly technological age. We live in a very computerized age. We live in the age of algorithms. And I thought, I wonder if you could arrive at an algorithm or a mathematical formula to figure out when somebody's ready to make use of their sensory appreciation. So you see, you do something like this. You take the number of lessons the person has had, you multiply it by the number of weeks that those lessons took place in, and that gives you, I think is mathematically called a product. Then you take the person's age in years, and you deduct that from the number 100. By the way, don't bother making notes about this because it's all a load of rubbish. So you deduct their age from the number 100, and the result of that, what did I do? Yes, then you deduct that result from the product of the multiplication of lessons and weeks. Then you divide that product by 10, and that gives you the number of months from the first lesson, at which point you can begin to consult your sensory experience. Wouldn't that be cool? But it isn't going to happen because it's all a load of rubbish. So obviously, there is no formula. You cannot pretend that there's something that will work for everyone. How are we doing for time? Peter, do you, is there a point where you'd like to take a 5 or 10 minute break?
I think it's up to you, but I think it usually is a good idea to have a break because 2 hours is too long for most people to pay attention.
Yes.
But it could be wherever you like. And we're well short of halfway through. So, but if that's the right time for you, that's fine too.
No, I'll go on a bit longer because yeah, so can we make some helpful suggestions about how a private student, a pupil's sensory register, kinesthesia, becomes gradually more useful and begins to feed into their daily practice of the Alexander technique. We've observed that the teacher's hands are bringing about sensory experiences of improved use. And notice, I'm talking here about hands-on Alexander lessons. I'm not talking about online video sessions. I'm just not going to go there, because I'm hoping that, you know, this is a temporary situation that we're in. It will eventually be resolved. Life will get back to something like it was before. And I do think that if the Alexander world were to lose the extraordinary skill that can be developed, the unique skill of good Alexander hands, I think it would be a terrible, terrible loss. So I hope we don't go there. Obviously, you know, in the present time, some of you will be doing some online teaching, and we have to make the best of it. And it may be that in the future, now people have had some experience of online teaching, I think it may very well be that there could, some kind of online work could become a useful adjunct to the process of hands-on lessons, just as group classes can be a very useful adjunct to individual hands-on lessons. But for the moment, what I'm talking about is the hands-on process. So there you are, using your hands to help bring about experiences of improved use. And these experiences, they sharpen your students' own awareness of use by giving the student a standard of comparison between their sense of themselves at the end of a good lesson and their sense of themselves perhaps near the end of a difficult, stressful, tiring day with a lot of pulling down. It's the contrast that is repeatedly being set up between the sensory experience of coming out of a good lesson in a much improved state of use, and that sharpening your awareness of when and how you fall away from that very often. But along with encouraging improved use, I think the teacher's job obviously also includes helping the student to practice inhibition and direction for themselves. As a series of lessons goes on with any particular pupil or student, you, the teacher, you begin to get a feeling sense through your hands on the student of how effective the student's own direction is becoming. And I think it's part of your role as a teacher to at times give verbal feedback about that. You see, many, back in, I think my first year of teaching or so, I remember there was someone who was coming both to me and to Dilys Carrington for lessons. And this woman said to me one day, she said, you know, I think you Alexander teachers, you're simply programmed to say, that's it, and that's good, at entirely random intervals during the lesson. I suppose it's good educational psychology because you just want to give us something positive. And that was a bit disappointing to me, because I thought, you know, when I said that's it or that's good, it was because I felt something changing in her in a positive way. But generally, that is the situation. It's not a good idea to randomly say, that's good, that's it, oh, you're doing well, without some tactile backup to it. So I think it's a good part of the process of giving lessons that over a series of lessons, you, as you with your hands, with your words, you're giving the person instructions about inhibiting and directing, And at times when with your hands you feel a positive change take place in the person, point that out, say something about it. You know, it might be something as simple as, that's it, that's better, that's good. It could be more precise. I've got my hands at somebody's neck and I feel that little lightening up through there. And I can say, yes, now there's a little bit more undoing in your neck. I've got a hand on somebody's back and I can say, oh, you're letting your lower back widen and come back more. You can even, I mean, I certainly do, I even say, can you feel that? Why not? You see, and of course, sometimes they'll say, no, I can't. At which point I'll say, well, you know, I've had a lot of training and experience in this, and part of my job is to be sensitive to pick these things up that are happening in you, maybe at a level just before they come fully into your consciousness, but they will come into your consciousness. So this verbal feedback, based on what you're feeling with your hands on the student, is part of educating how the student's own sensory appreciation matches up with their own ability to inhibit and direct. So in this way, you can be gradually building up your students' confidence in both their own conscious inhibition and direction, and also confidence in the increasing accuracy of their own sensory appreciation. So you could say in the lesson, you've got three elements going on. You've got the bringing about of experiences of improved use. You've got verbally instructing your student about conscious inhibition and direction. And you've got giving them some verbal feedback about their progress based on the tactile feedback you're getting from your hands on them as they inhibit and direct and move. And actually, Peter, for me, because the next thing I'm going to say goes off onto a little bit of a sidetrack, this would be a good moment to take a break. This is also a good moment before I take this another step to pick up on any immediate questions so far. So are there any burning questions that people want to raise at this point?
I have one which I've noticed, John, which is the way you're using language, which I'm very interested in, the question of language that we use and it being contemporary, and how you're using the word kinesthesia, especially in the beginning. You referenced kinaesthetic kinesthesia. Do you feel that is an equivalent way of talking about faulty sensory appreciation?
Yes, I do. Yes, and then you, of course, then you can have arguments about kinesthesia and proprioception. And well, my impression is that among the scientific people, among the people who actually really scientifically study and research this area, proprioception is the commonly used term now. But if you talk to what I would call professional movers, in particularly dancers, kinesthesia is widely used there. And they would say, you know, because the term itself has more of a connotation of movement. Does kine come from a Greek for movement, something like that? But I think I think they're all fairly interchangeable. Sensory appreciation, proprioception, kinesthesia, sensory register, which Alexander also used. There's another whole area here of when he said feeling, to what extent did he mean it to cover emotional responses as well as physical sensations. Is this the time to say anything about? I think I'd like to hold that till later, okay? But if I fail to get to it, Sue, jump in and nudge me and remind me.
Okay.
John, I have a question that if I just a quickie, but when in the beginning you talked about Alexander's description of the first lesson and that we wouldn't go into it quite like that. I was always told that Alexander assumed that people had read at least one of his books before they came, which of course is not usually the case now, that people will have very much understanding at all. Would that not have made a difference in how you approach the first lesson?
I don't know the answer to that, because although like you, I heard that he asked people to read one of the books, I've also had the pleasure of giving lessons to people who originally had lessons from FM. Because in later years, some of them used to come to Walter, and if he was busy, I sometimes got to see them, which was always fascinating. And, you know, some of them said, well, you know, he said we should read the books, but, you know, I couldn't read those books. They'd get one of the books and read the first chapter. So I don't know, Britta. And gosh, there was something else I was going to say about that. No, sorry, I've forgotten what the other thing was. Anything else there? Are we all okay to carry?
John, if I can ask just a quick one. So when you were talking about, I'm coming from
Person who's speaking.
It's Tanya.
Tanya,
I'm currently,
yeah.
yes, I'm currently in British school. I came from Anthony's school, so I kind of have two very different approaches. So for me, as I started in more inhibition and doing schools and less direction schools,
Can I just, I didn't catch that. You said I started with more inhibition and
with Anthony, yeah, so less direction
inhibition
school.
with Anthony, okay.
Yes, so it's like the egg or the hen is our chicken. What's coming first is the ability to stop and inhibit. So what are we teaching first? And I understand that it's very much depending on the person, on who is in front of us, but it seems to have, like from my training, very different approaches. So the first school is more teaching you to stop and inhibit and do nothing. And the second school is more directions and everything else. And I'm still trying to figure out where I am.
Well, I mean, you know, I suppose the simple answer, Tanya, is we need both. But, you know, because I've been around the Alexander world, literally around the world of the Alexander world in different countries, and I've been around it for a long time, I appreciate what you're saying. I know you do see these differences of emphasis in different training courses. Over whichever end you approach it from, you can't really entirely separate inhibition from direction. You see, I came to the technique from a background of having been interested in aspects of meditation practice, Buddhist Vipassana, a little bit of the Gurdjieff type work, other things around that area. I've had quite a lot of psychotherapy at difficult times of my life. All these and many other psychological and spiritual practices are trying to help you to be, as they would say, less reactive, which is inhibition. It's saying, whoop, stop. Say, no, I'm not going to jump into this. So inhibition per se is not at all unique to the Alexander technique. Some teachers, I'm afraid, tend to speak of it as if it is, you know, the most important, the crucial thing is the technique teaches you to say no. Well, there are lots of things that are trying to help you in your life to say no. It's combining that with direction to this thing we call primary control that gives you the full power of the technique. So which way around you want to approach that, whether you want to approach it from the inhibitory end or from the directive end, as long as eventually you can communicate how interwoven, essentially interwoven these things have to be, then, you know, I think it's up to the teacher's choice and the teacher's temperament and the student's temperament from which end you get to it. You know. I'll just add one more thing, Tanya, which I learned, I think, actually from Peggy Williams and Walter Carrington, the preference for helping someone to have an experience of improved use so that there was some purpose to the inhibition and direction. But, you know, that's just something that appealed to me. But yeah, as I say, you know, we've all got to get to that point where we see how enmeshed it all is. Is that good enough? Are we ready? Yeah, we ready to go on? What, should I look at that, Julia? Do you need me to look at what you put in there, or should I?
No, I was just replying. It was an add-on to what you're saying. Just replying to somebody else in the chat. Because kinesthetic is or kinesthetic, proprioceptive, yeah, that's kind of, you could say principally, or the main range of senses that we're working with, but surely sort of sensory appreciation is really all of our senses. You know, we don't all see the same way, we don't hear the same way. So, you know, I think all of our senses must undergo transformation through learning the Alexander technique. So that's maybe the beauty of sensory appreciation. It's a wider term.
Well, Julia, reading FM, reading the diary accounts written by people who took lessons with him, talking to and giving lessons to people who had lessons with him. Let's say, I think it's fair to say, the huge emphasis is at the kinesthetic level. He's not doing a lot very directly with your sense of hearing, your sense of taste, your eyesight directly, and so on. When you, and of course, one of his phrases to describe the work was the phrase kinesthetic re-education. So, you know, while it may have knock-on effects on the other senses, I think it's reasonable to say that it's the kinesthetic one that we're.
Yeah, so I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just adding something, which is, you know, it's like sort of the way we perceive. We don't perceive sight and then we perceive touch. It's the way we actually perceive. It's all of that information gets kind of in a big kind of smorgasbord in your brain. You come out with, oh yes, I've just touched something hot, or, you know, I saw something. It's not really like that. It's everything's kind of meshed up together. So just to not kind of ignore the other senses.
Yeah, fair enough. Isn't that one of the issues in neuroscience, how the brain and the nervous system can somehow, what's the word, amalgamate all of that in.
Thank you.
So I think I will then carry on, and then we can get to the point where we can bring in more questions. But what I wanted to get to next was something about how a person, a student in a lesson, might respond to the teacher's hands, the sensation, the contact of a teacher's hands on them. And this includes the issue of to what extent should a student be noticing the feel of the teacher's hands, noticing the feeling of any effects of the teacher's hands on them. And I did have a very useful experience once in London with the quite renowned first generation teacher called Peggy Williams. Peggy was giving a turn to somebody on a table, and she was saying to that person, or let's say she could sense, she could perceive, perhaps using all her senses, that this person, the student, the person lying on the table, was trying to feel or getting involved in feeling the hands and the effect of the hands. And Peggy said this: don't try to feel what my hands are doing. However, do let your consciousness register any feelings or changes that may come to you. In fact, that's an important part of how we learn from lessons. So I'll say that again, because it's really, I mean, this was a long time ago, but over the decades, certain things have really lodged in my memory because they seem to be so important. And this was a good one. Don't try to feel what my hands are doing. However, do let your consciousness register any feelings or changes that may come to you. That's an important part of how you learn from lessons. So, what's the difference between trying to feel the teacher's hands and the effect they're having, or allowing any feelings or changes to come to your consciousness? I'm going to guide you through a little exercise that I think helps to illustrate the difference between those two things. And so this little exercise, actually, I am first of all going to use your sense of vision. I'm going to use your eyesight first, and then we're going to use your kinesthetic or proprioceptive sense. So first of all, what you need to do is have a look around the room that you're sitting in, and I want you to find some small point somewhere over there that you can focus on visually. When I say a small point, I mean, for example, if I look around my office here, there are the knobs, the handles on the drawers, in the chest of drawers over there. There's a small, round, beautifully, smoothly carved piece of New Zealand wood over there as a memento. There's a little crystal thing there. Pick something small. And now that you've picked your small object, I want you deliberately, for a few seconds, I want you to really look at that object, really focus on it, really look at it, really let it fill your field of awareness, take in every detail of it. It really is the center of your attention, that small point or object. And notice how your neck feels and how your breathing feels. And then let your vision expand, let your back expand, let your neck release. Come back and up into your back to let your head release, to let your vision and all your senses connect to the entire space around you. So here you are with a lengthening and widening back now, and a broadening, widening field of vision. And within that overall expanded field, just let the sight of that small object come to you as part of that overall expanded field. And notice the difference, particularly in your neck and your breathing. So pause a moment. And if I said, do most of you notice a difference? Would it, I'm going to not take too much time over this, but I think there'll probably be fairly general agreement that when you've got that single point focus on that object, it really does have a tendency to narrow you psychophysically, to shrink you just as your point of vision shrinks. Is there anybody who would strongly disagree with that, or can we all just take that as fairly obvious? And I should add, I was talking to somebody the other day about this, that it's not that that's always wrong. And if you work in a profession where that is necessary, that kind of single point focus is really necessary. If you are a Swiss watchmaker, if you are a brain surgeon, you probably need an ability to single point like that. And if you had lots of Alexander lessons, you may be able to learn to have that narrow, tight focus without narrowing and tightening your whole self. And certainly if I were rushed to hospital and needed brain surgery, I would like my brain surgeon to be very good at that kind of narrow focus. It would give me a lot more confidence if he or she was. So now let's bring that into the more directly Alexander realm. And imagine you're in a lesson, you're sitting, and the teacher reaches over and puts a hand on your left knee. Now, as soon as you feel that contact on your left knee, I want you to really direct all your attention to your left knee. Really feel what's going on there. What's she trying to do? What's she aiming at? What's the purpose of this? I don't feel anything different. Or maybe I do, maybe I do. Just keep what's going on. Keep that questioning attention in that left knee. And of course, you'll find that it subtly drags all of you down towards that left knee, or I might even say forward and down towards that left knee. Now, obviously, that's the unhelpful kind of being drawn into feeling what's happening. But the solution to that is not to give up feeling altogether, not to say to yourself, oh, I'm not supposed to feel. You just come back, as we did with the visual exercise. Come back and up into your back. Let your back widen to breathe. Let your neck release to let your head lighten up. Arms and legs releasing out of the back in order to connect to the world around you. You're going up, you're lengthening and widening into the world, opening yourself, being more porous to what's around you, being more part of the world instead of separate from it. Within that open field, just ask, oh, is there any information from my left knee coming in within that field? And you see, it's that kind of, when you begin to appreciate that the process of undoing and opening up in yourself in an Alexander way, the process we loosely call going up, or lengthening and widening, or freeing the neck to let the head go up and the back lengthen and widen. This is what I like to think of now as a psychophysical attitude in all the meanings of the word attitude. So it's an expansiveness, it's a turning up and out of your being, of your attitude. And this indeed connects you more with the world around you, makes you more transparent to the world around you. And in that way, anything that's something like, oh, what's the teacher doing with my left leg there, will just let it come to your consciousness, as Peggy Williams said. Because, as she said, that's part of how you learn from lessons. When you walk away after a lesson, let your consciousness register any changes that have taken place, because that's part of how you learn. Now, there was an American teacher some years back with a wonderfully American name, in fact, Missy Vineyard. And Missy wrote a book, whose title, is it something, I'm afraid I'm blanking on the title, the Missy Vineyard book.
Kind of how you stand, how you move, how, yeah.
Sorry?
It's kind of, it's something along the lines of how you stand, how you move.
How you live.
Yes, somebody's bringing the book. Is it Rhiannon over there? How you stand, how you move, how you live. That's the book. Yeah, thank you, Rhiannon. The reason I mention it is that Missy was very aware of this issue, but Missy's solution to it was to ask people, she had a phrase she used to say, stay up in the attic, stay up in the attic. And what she was getting at is the tendency to be drawn down into the area you want to feel. And so staying up in the attic meant don't let yourself be drawn down there. And you could say it's another way of saying, allow your consciousness to register feelings that come to you. I happen to have a preference myself for opening up to connect to the world around you, and linking that with a lengthening and widening process. Because I think there's a slight danger sometimes that if you're thinking, I've got to stay up here, I've got to stay up here, you become a bit of a sort of a head up in here, a bit too much in your head, in the perhaps pejorative sense of that phrase. But there are different aspects of observing the same phenomenon. When you've observed that phenomenon in yourself, how easy it is to be drawn forward and down into what you're trying to feel, it becomes easier, of course, when you're a teacher, to notice it in the people you're giving lessons to. So it becomes easier to, as part of your process of educating their sensory appreciation, pointing that out to them when they're going into it in the unhelpful way. However, I have to tell you a funny little thing that happened to me way back in my early years of teaching about the things students, private students, pupils say about how they direct. Just pause while I finish this for a moment. There was someone coming to see me way back in the early years in London, and she was making remarkably good progress. I remember, you know, from one lesson to the next, she'd come in and I'd put my hands on, I think, wow, she's really going up. This thing is really working. So at some point after a number of lessons, I said to her, I'm so impressed. You know, you really seem to be getting this. It's terrific. It's so, you really are exceptional in how you're progressing. And then I said, I'm curious, how are you getting this, you know, in between the lessons, and when you're at home, when you're at work, in your life in between the lessons, how do you go about encouraging this for yourself? Oh, she said, it's quite easy. I just imagine your hands on me and the feeling of your hands on me, and it all happens. Now, the first thought that came into my head was, no, you're not supposed to do that. That's all wrong. The second thought that came into my head was, but she's doing really, really well. How can, having just said to this person how well she's doing, how can I now say, you're doing it all wrong? And I mention this just to illustrate. Well, several things. Don't be too dogmatic as a teacher to jump in and say, that's wrong, that's wrong. And sit back a little and consider the possibility that I might say, if it works, it works. What's more important, whether it works or whether they adhere to your perhaps somewhat constrained view of how it should work? So that's one thing about it, to be open to, if it works, it works. The other thing about it is that the private student's description in words of how they're putting this into practice may not quite correspond to how you would interpret those words. So again, you know, there's quite a lot of area for confusion. You know, even the word thinking, after all, you know, what does think mean? It has all kinds of meanings. So just, you know, from that little story, be cautious about how you interpret and how you respond to what a student might say about how they go about it. And especially if your hands are telling you it's working. Yes, so we're coming near to the end of what I'm planning to say, but I've also got some quotes from significant, well-known first-generation teachers that I wanted to share with you on this same subject. And actually, just last night, there's only one page of these, but last night I put these up on my website as well. And again, under the video, podcast, and articles menu, directly underneath the selection of FM quotes on reliable sensory appreciation, you'll find a PDF that says something like quotes from first-generation teachers about kinesthesia. So here's one from the recently published Irene Tasker book. Irene Tasker writes, "The books can be a considerable help to a pupil during a course of lessons or afterwards. Only after a pupil, in the hands of a teacher, has begun to gain a more reliable sensory appreciation, will he or she be fully able to grasp the meaning and the significance of the writings." Here's Frank Pierce Jones. "Ultimately, a pupil must be able to make reliable kinesthetic observations of himself in activity. The purpose of the lessons is to sharpen the kinesthetic sense and to increase self-knowledge and self-control." Pat McDonald, "By this time, the pupil's sensory mechanisms will have been considerably re-educated, and he will be able to rely more and more on the information received from them." Marjorie Barlow, "There's no doubt that as you go on working over the years, the sense of yourself, your kinesthetic sense, does become re-educated. It still doesn't mean that you know when you're right, but you do know better when you're wrong." And my favorite one actually comes from Walter, because I think it's got rather a cute kind of metaphor or analogy in it. He says, "The re-education of feeling very much involves it becoming an efficient alarm system rather than a guide. In fact, the analogy of an alarm system isn't a bad one. You wouldn't want an alarm fitted to your car that tells you all the time, I am not being stolen, I am not being stolen, I am not being stolen. You only want to know when it is being stolen. That's the moment when the alarm should sound. I rather enjoy that. But those last two from Walter and from Marjorie Barlow particularly link in with one of the quotes I read from FM, that it's when you're going wrong, it's when you're interfering with your use, that it will pop up an alert, a warning, a flash, a signal. And certainly that's been my experience more and more. Let me just find my notes. Lost the page, oh dear. Have to improvise. That's scary.
We had the red herring that you didn't deal with. Is this a good time to raise it?
No, it isn't. Sorry. Just let me get to the end of this. You know, I'm nearly there, then you can raise it. I found my notes. Okay. Yeah, so, you know, that, as I say, that's been my experience, that it's much more, it's not so much that I go around a lot of the time sort of congratulating myself. Gosh, I'm going well. Oh, I'm going so well. Oh, isn't this good? Oh, yes, that's the way. Oh, excellent, excellent, splendid. It's not, you don't go around, you know, congratulating yourself on your good use. But where it really works is those occasions when into my consciousness comes an awareness of discomfort, pressure, that's saying to me, John, you're pulling down, you're making a mess of this. And that's when we can consider, how would I or how would you respond to that? And, you know, let's be honest here, because there are times when I respond to it, particularly at the end of a long, tiring day, when I respond to it by thinking, oh, sorry, I'm tired. I can't be bothered with this, but we'll start again tomorrow morning. And, you know, fine, you know, we all have a right to take a break. We're self-regulating individuals. You don't want to feel too guilty about it. You're never going to be perfect. If you thought you were, it's time to walk away from it now. You never will be. However, on good days, that sense comes to me of discomfort, pressure, tension somewhere. Now, here's what I'm not going to do. You know, I'm going to inhibit the desire to immediately straighten up, lift up, lighten up. I'm going to inhibit any desire to what I would call manipulate my body in order to relieve the sense of pressure or discomfort. So, in fact, all of you right now, just a little bit of self-reflection right now. Don't change your posture. Don't change your position. Just ask yourself, are there any areas of pressure, discomfort, internal pressure? And if there are, can I just not get drawn into them, but just give some simple Alexander directive thought, release the neck, let the head lighten up out of the body, come back and up into your back, to let the back widen, to let the ribs move, to let the arms release out from the back and the shoulders, to let the legs release out from the lower back of the pelvis, to let the feet open onto the floor, to let your eyes open onto the world, to let that lengthening and widening connect you with your environment. And still within that expanded field, are there any little areas that still feel like they could decompress? And if so, ask them to decompress, and ask them to decompress in such a way that it feeds into that overall coming back and up, lengthening and widening and connecting to the outside. And that's really how you put it into practice, I think we could say. So put my notes aside. I'm going to come back. I'm going to come to the topic of feeling in the emotional sense briefly. And I'm going to say something else about, or something I haven't touched on, about why I think some of these questions about feeling and sensory awareness have at times had a negative psychological effect within the Alexander world. But before that, one or two people had questions coming in there. Who was it? Somebody said was it a red herring? Who's the red herring person?
No, the red herring was the feeling and emotion one.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come to that.
Yeah.
Anything else before we get to that? All okay? Good. How are we doing for time? 20 minutes or so.
John, I want to say to you that if you're not in a hurry, if people have questions afterwards, they could stay on. That means people can drift away if they need to, and others can stay. If that's all right with you.
No, I think by 12 o'clock I'll have had enough, Peter.
All right, well, fine. I sympathize with that.
No, I do, I've done a fair bit of
Oh,
this.
it's intense. Yes.
120 minutes really is my limit.
Oh, yeah.
I'll go for 90 minutes, but
Sure.
I think 2 hours is the limit.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question regarding pain?
Yeah.
And responding to pain. I mean, it's not necessarily excruciating pain, but little niggling pain, because sometimes I get the feeling that it's a very useful feedback, and other times I feel it's a red herring. There's like something that wants to get my attention there. And the pain comes. It's nearly like I forget about it, and I think about it, and oh, the pain is here.
Yeah. What exactly is the question, though?
It's not really a very specific question. I was wondering whether you had something to say about how pain and how to respond to it, but it's not essential. If you want to move on, I'm fine with that. Yes.
Let me just think for a second. So I can't quite see your name. Is it Marie? Marie. Okay.
Marie.
Marie. You see, you said not excruciating pain, little pains. And I when I said, do you notice any discomfort and pressure? I think little pains I put under that heading of discomfort.
Well, I guess I know what my question is. Does pain or discomfort always mean there's something wrong?
No. On the subject of pain, obviously, if I as teacher am giving lessons to somebody and they tell me that during the lesson they're getting increasing pain, I'm going to back off. I'm not a medical professional. I don't have insurance to cover medical issues. It would cost me a hell of a lot if I did. So I'm not going to be responsible for pain situations. I think that's worth bearing in mind, because I have a brother younger than me and living near Melbourne in Australia, and he is a very, very, very experienced osteopath. And osteopaths have a great deal of medical training, and he really is equipped with the knowledge and the tools to be more responsible for pain situations. He has the ability to diagnose, he has the ability to order all sorts of tests and scans and x-rays and what have you. Therefore, he can charge a lot more for his sessions than I charge, and you'd be astounded at the amount he pays in an annual insurance premium. So generally, serious pain, I want to back off from and suggest that the person really should see a medical professional about it. Now, there are occasions when people feel aches. I'm using the word ache in English because it might suggest a mild pain. And there's one situation in particular that I think is interesting. I've often had people point to the upper thoracic area up between the shoulder blades during a lesson and say that they're feeling achiness, slight pain, tension in that area. And very often that can be a good sign. That's one of the situations where pain, when it's not intense, small pain in that area, often occurs because the person who's been very collapsed, as they come up and open out, although we put great emphasis on undoing and release and letting go, you have to bear in mind that in the process of going up, lengthening and widening, you are also re-establishing tone, particularly in the musculature that supports the head and spine. And it's that upper and mid thoracic area that gets particularly collapsed like this in the collapsed person. And as you change that, you can almost bring about the kind of muscle ache of new muscular activity. So that's worth bearing in mind. And there may be other similar situations in parts of the body. So I'm not sure, Marie, where else can we go with there? I don't think I've really satisfied your question, but I'm not sure where else to go with it.
Anyway, so, please go on, you know.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think, yes, I think just to emphasize there that if you've got somebody coming for lessons who's come across the technique by reading that it's all about relaxation, release of tension, letting go, and as is often said in the United States, actually, among Alexander people, that it's all about ease of movement and using less effort, ease of movement. You know, well, if you go from very collapsed to actually really coming up, there is in fact a great increase of muscular tone. Having a good back, as the first generation teachers in London used to say, really has an element of redistributing and reorganizing tone rather than letting go of all tension. So I think that has to be borne in mind, you know, that for someone, if someone comes with misconceptions about this whole area of relaxation and tension, that to communicate that we're in the business of redistributing tone or tension rather than getting rid of all tension is useful. So anything else, and then we'll take a look at the feeling, the broader sense of feeling. Now, it's often come up as a question of whether when Alexander spoke about feeling, whether he actually, and particularly when he spoke about feelings being unreliable, was he speaking in the broader sense of emotional responses as well as physical? One day during, I think in my first year of training at Lansdowne Road, I brought in a book that I'd been reading, because sometimes you could be sitting around there without much to do in your first term or so, waiting for somebody to give you a turn. And I thought, oh, I'll carry on reading my book. And it was all very highbrow. I was a bit kind of pretentious at that time. And I was reading a book of English literary criticism. It was a book by William Empson that was quite famous in literary criticism fields at that time. It was called The 7 Types of Ambiguity. And Walter came over to give me a turn, and he saw the title of the book that was on the table beside me, 7 Types of Ambiguity. And this led him to say, you know, most of us, we like to be clear in our communication. So we like to avoid ambiguity. You know, we want to have clarity, not ambiguity. But Walter said FM actually liked ambiguity. FM enjoyed words that had a wide range of meaning, so that if he chose a word, he usually wanted to incorporate all the aspects of its meaning. So from that point of view, FM would have liked the ambiguity of the word feeling. But I did also have a conversation with Erica Whittaker, who was on the very first training course in the early 1930s. She was of the opinion that FM really did not extend it to emotional responses, that it was purely, he was referring to physical or kinesthetic sensations. So who knows? And you see, back in FM's day, there was a very famous American philosopher and psychologist called William James, whose brother Henry James was always a famous novelist. William James is still, I think, highly regarded in the field of, you know, among neuroscientists and psychologists. And I think he was one of the first people to point out, I believe there was something called the James-Langer, L-A-N-G-E, theory of emotions. I think Langer, I'm afraid I don't know who Langer was, must have been a colleague of William James. But the gist of it is that you can't really separate physical sensations from emotional responses. I mean, it was, let's say in the mid to late 19th century, people would probably assume that if I became angry about something that had happened, my feeling angry would stimulate physical responses in my body, which would be caused by the fact that I am feeling the emotion of anger. But James was saying, no, it isn't really like that. The physical responses are the anger, and what you call the emotion is your subjective consciousness that is the inside of the outside, if you see what I mean. If we say the outside is the neurophysiological, hormonal, etc. responses, the inside is the subjective aspect of that, which I experience as, my God, I'm angry, etc. So when you look at it like that, you know, you can't make such a big distinction between the two. And it's quite clear that FM, in the way that he writes about these things, clearly believes, and I suppose therefore must have experienced in himself and in his students, that changing your use through inhibition, direction, and so on, not only refines your kinesthesia, your sensory register at that level, but as FM sometimes wrote, can put you more in touch with your reason. Or in another phrase he used, you would be less liable to what he called emotional gusts, which I think is rather a splendid phrase. Now, I would say when I first came into the Alexander technique, I was a physical and psychological wreck. I was very aware of being emotionally, psychologically extremely messed up, nervous, anxious, tense, depressed, irritable, God knows what, a mass of conflicting emotions. And when I began trying to practice some form of meditation, I became aware that I was also a mass of physical and muscular tension. And it slowly dawned on me that these two things might just possibly have something to do with each other. And eventually I stumbled into the Alexander technique and realized, oh, they do have something to do with each other. But you see, at that stage, we're talking, I don't know, age 26, something like that. Still a mess, slightly less of a mess, but still a mess. You know, I had this naive idea that by practicing meditation and the Alexander technique, I would rise above this emotional mess, that somehow, you know, I could become a person exhibiting constructive conscious control of the individual. And, you know, because I would have constructive conscious control of the individual, I wouldn't be plagued by these pesky emotions anymore. And of course, you know what a disaster that can be. And that's what led me and many others into psychotherapy, because you realize, oh my God, they're not going to go away, you know. And as I think Jung says somewhere, Carl Jung, that, you know, for consciousness believing it can control everything is a bit like the tip of the iceberg, thinking that it's in charge with all the rest of the iceberg that's under the water. Possibly a recipe for driving yourself nuts. Certainly a recipe for increased neurosis. So I think I don't think I've been the only person to fall into that trap. I've seen it quite often around the Alexander world, you know, the sort of, I'm light, I'm bright, I'm always happy, I'm going up, I'm never depressed, here I am, bright, light, and happy because I practice the Alexander technique. Fake news, fake happiness, you know. Similarly, you know, the head controlling the body kind of thing gives rise to that. So on the one hand, I think there's this danger of believing that the technique is somehow going to enable you to transcend those awkward emotions. Whereas in fact, I think in the end, if you really make use of it, as you become more kinesthetically sensitive, you become more sensitive to your own emotional states as they come and go. And that is really, in a way, part of the purpose of good psychotherapy, is to educate you in self-awareness at the emotional level. Well, let's say at the emotional and behavioral level. And the technique is a great aid in that. And then I think the other possible danger is that being told your feelings are unreliable can, in some people, create an ongoing element of insecurity and what I would call a lack of autonomy. It's almost inculcating in you a lack of self-trust, a lack of self-reliance. And of course, as we've spoken about earlier this morning, it's necessary. Well, if I go back to when I said to you at the beginning, I said to you, I can summarize this in 2 sentences, the headline. And of course, the first sentence was that when you begin having lessons, you may need to put your sensory appreciation, your feelings of what's happening, you may need to keep them in abeyance to allow the experience of the lessons to take hold. But that doesn't mean you keep them in abeyance indefinitely. So, you know, it's bad enough that the mistaken ideas of perfection in the Alexander world are bad enough in terms of how, you know, if you have a personality that drifts towards self-doubt and even self-blame and self-recrimination, you can have a field day with the Alexander technique. You can beat yourself to death with the Alexander technique. You will never be good enough with the Alexander technique. So, you know, that's a road we really don't want to go down. You know, we want to help people to have more self-worth, more stability, more confidence, not using the technique to endlessly feel I'm never going to be good enough. So is there anything to add to that? Nope. No further questions? No further comments? Is that Eleni there? No?
Oh, yes, I was thinking about the question.
You've unmuted yourself.
Yes. So what would you suggest would be a more constructive way to use to think about the unreliable feeling? If we're not to go down the route of self-doubt.
Well, go back over all the things I've said earlier this morning, Eleni. You know, get from Peter the recording of this and go back and listen to it, because you know how, you know, part of the purpose of lessons is to build up a student's confidence in the increasing accuracy of their perceptions. And I find, and I know a lot of other people have found this, there is something, again, I so much of this I see increasingly is so deeply psychophysical. And you know, it's taken me decades, I would say, to fully appreciate and experience what psychophysical can mean, the depth of it. That's why I love this word attitude, that coming back into your back, letting your back widen as well as lengthen, has a sense of security about it. It gives you, I'm almost tempted to say, it gives you something to lean on, you know. You really do become, again, in every sense of the expression, a more self-supporting person. Truly, Eleni, believe it, honestly, you know, let that really work through you into your very attitude, that you are and you will be increasingly more and more self-supporting psychophysically. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think, John, your remarks about lengthening and widening in order to connect into the world is so important in relation to what you've just said. And I think we all have moments of self-doubt. I don't know whether Alexander ever had the moments of self-doubt or not, but it's rather related to what you were saying about authenticity. It's almost like those people that have no self-doubt, they seem a little bit lacking in authenticity.
Yes, yes, I'd agree with that, but I don't know, you know, do we know if FM ever had any self-doubt? I mean, you know, Michael Bloch's biography of FM indicates FM was blessed with absolute devotion from his mother, who told him from an early age that he was destined to be a very exceptional person. No doubt that might help you to have a strong sense of self-worth in life, but who knows?
There's that wonderful bit in the autobiographical sketch, you know, that's in letters and articles and lectures, where he seeks advice about whether or not to leave Australia for the UK, and people give him lots of advice, and he takes none of it. He was not easily dissuaded by other people's opinions, I think, which is
this this question of self-doubt and the way that the Alexander technique can be misused or misinterpreted to drain a person's confidence, to make a person feel less self-reliant, I personally think goes along with what I would call the myth of the perfect child, which I think has been very prevalent in Alexander circles. And that in turn goes with the reflex explanation of how the Alexander technique works. And it goes something like this, that we're all born with an innate set of built-in reflexes to organize posture and movement and everything we call use. It's all there, built in from birth. And early on, it all works perfectly in us. You know, you see Alexander books with beautiful pictures of small children illustrating wonderful aspects of good use. And then, well, for those of us like myself brought up as a Catholic, you know, we fall into original sin. We commit the original sin of developing bad habits. And because of the sins of these bad habits, we have to perform penance of multitudinous hundreds of thousands of euros, dollars, or pounds to pay for lessons, to educate ourselves out of these sinful bad habits, and countless hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades to return to perfection. And here we sit looking at each other on a screen, and are we perfect? No. Will we ever be perfect? No. Do we care? No. Why should we? Because you see, it is a myth. I mean, I've had 2 children. They were not perfect. Not even from early on. You know, you could see, well, you know, I could see my own patterns, my own physical structure, and the difficulties that it could give rise to, and so on. And no, we don't have an inbuilt set of perfect reflexes. And if you want to understand more on that subject, I really, really recommend Tim Cacciatore and Patrick Johnson's work. Go to their website, alexandertechniquescience.com, read everything on there. If you possibly can, join their online seminars, and you will have an education in why the reflex model is completely out of date. Much more relevant to us is to look at this as a learning process. As a baby, as a toddler, you and I were learning, even if it was unconscious, how to organize posture, balance, movement, etc. How to organize our use. And, you know, some aspects of it we mostly learned rather badly. But the great thing about that is that later as adults, we can relearn more consciously and learn better. And in that way, I think it's very important to see this as, in a sense, a journey of human potential. Instead of this really rather, in a way, slightly negative view that you were perfect once and you fell out of the Garden of Eden and you've got to struggle back into the Garden of Perfection. That's kind of depressing, especially when you get to my age and you haven't got back in the garden yet. But much more positive is to think the technique has been amazing throughout my life for helping to open me up more in all sorts of ways to discover more of my potential. I think, you know, human potential. It's a journey and an exploration. It doesn't have an end point of perfection. I'm done, I think.
It was a nice finish. A natural time.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank
Excellent.
you so much, John. I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say how grateful we are that you came to visit us today and how much we've learned from you and how much we've got to go away to think about.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for turning up and hanging in there and listening. Okay.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
You had a good lesson from John Nicholls.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks very much.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Oh.
Bye.
A quick reminder